and the development of the Cubism, and we discuss in a greater detail its scientific connection. But surely enough, Cubism grew up from the group which originally was related to this little building in Montmartre, and had become a dominating direction of art development at the beginning of the 20th century, and it had survived the First War, and right after First War, there was another major phenomenon which was not truly scientific, which had happened, and that was the October Revolution in Russia. And as we shall see today, the political events of the revolution, independently of the character of those revolution, which we shall not discuss, had a considerable influence on the development of the art in the 20th century, and we will be discussing certain consequences of it in what today. And now I will share the screen, and yes, and as always, there is a problem with it. And this is already our 6th lecture. And I shall start with mentioning an art and contribution to the art of the 20th century by Russian Jewish painter, sculptor, and stained glass master, Marc Chagall. This is a picture of Marc Chagall, who was born in the little town of Vitebsk in now Belarusia. And Marc Chagall was incredibly productive artist, and he left Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and sure enough, he went to Paris, and there he very quickly get associated with those group of artists which have been the originator of a Cubism, and that is, for example, one of his early paintings from that period called I and the Village. And that is a painting which is a Cubist style painting, in which you immediately see the elements which have been through all the life of Marc Chagall, almost always appearing on his pieces of art. And these are his memories of his life in that little village of Vitebsk, which was a huge center of the Jewish culture in Russia. And you watching all those pictures of Chagall from the Vitebsk time, before he went to Paris and after he returned, you easily recognize from where the stage set, those people who arranged the stage set for the famous movie Fiddler at the Roof took the direction of setting up the stage set and and the whole movie is so much in the Chagall art style. So Chagall was in Paris, but his fiancée and later wife was still in Russia. And when the First War started, Marc Chagall had returned to Vitebsk, and but to show you how deeply he was impressed and associated with this intellectual how should I say, a stream of developing the art which originated in this wash house on Montmartre, is this painting, which is called Homage to Apollinaire. We were talking about that Apollinaire was the active brain of that art direction, and that was the Homage to Apollinaire painted by Marc Chagall. He returned to Vitebsk, and revolution had happened. And after the revolution, Chagall was impressed and influenced by the direction of the changes which have been introduced or were projected to be introduced by the victorious Bolshevik party, and he became collaborating with them. And this is one of his propaganda-like paintings he had painted from that time. This is a piece to the Sachs War and on the palaces. And this is another picture from that period. This is called Over the Town. This is a town of Vitebsk, and there is this young Jewish pair floating in the air. And very soon, Chagall accepted a position to be a director of a kind of Academy of Art, which has been set up by the new government of Russia in Vitebsk. It was called People Art School. This is the picture of that building as it looks now. And that People Art School has rapidly, in a question of a few years, become a hub, a center of explosion of a revolution in the paintings and the other branch of art, which we have not mentioned so far, and which I believe we are allowed to include into our discussion as an art and culture, namely the architecture. And there were also, this school had a tremendous influence on the all art of the 20th century. So let me show you some what happened later. Well, as you know from the history, the revolution usually have this, after the excitement phase, at the beginning, that it is bringing something deeply new and refreshing, it decays and it devours its own children, as it is said. And very soon in the 20s, Chagall and many other artists from the Vitebsk school, we already were talking about the Strzemiński and Katarzyna Kobro. They were also students and worked for a while in that school. They left and the school deteriorated. And Chagall personally had emigrated to the West. He was living in France. in various places in France. And when the Second War came, he escaped from Europe and he went to the United States. He spent all the war in the United States. And after the war, I believe in the late 40s, he had returned back to France. And one of his post-war pieces of art is the stained glass, which is in the Fraumünster in Zurich. He made these stained glasses in 1970. I'm showing you how it looks like in a church. And that is the close-up of one part of that yellowish stained glass. And if you will be looking very carefully, what is possibly not that easy on the computer screen, you can see that the colors and the type of the picture which is there is essentially that from the time of young Chagall, when he was painting the, let's say it, common life in Vitebsk. I'm also showing you this stained glass I would like you to bring back in the memory the picture of the stained glass made by the Polish stained glass master Stanisław Wyspiański. We discussed at the beginning of our lectures this godfather creating the earth, which is in the Franciscaner church in Krakow. It's much easier to go and see the Wyspiański in Krakow nowadays than to go to Zurich. At this, as far as I know, you don't need to have a PCR test before going to Krakow. And in any case, I strongly advise you to take a vaccination if you haven't done it so far. And and I like you to compare these two stained glasses, and I'm absolutely sure that if the Wyspiański stained glass was in Fraumünster in Zurich, it will be considered to be the masterpiece of the stained glasses, modern stained glasses. But this is the Chagall stained glasses, which is considered to be the world piece of that particular art. And the Chagall school had many students and collaborators, and they have been slowly departing from the direction of Cubism, and they set up their own trend in art, which had developed. And one of those painters who have been associated with the Vitebsk school and was teaching there also was Lazar Ellisitski. This is his photography, who had been one of those young artists who had used his talent and to become a propaganda painter of the revolution. What you see on the left is one of his propaganda posters. We have already seen that Chagall himself was not against using his talents and art to make a propaganda pieces. And that is another piece of a particular style of Lisitsky, which is a propaganda of the to call for a support to the Red Army in the fight with what was called the White Army, the army of the post-Tsar generals who had been trying to organize counter-revolution, but they spent more time fighting between themselves, and they have been successfully defeated by the Red Army. And that is the Red Army being injected into the white circle, and that is of course, a propaganda for the victory of a Red Army over the white uprisings. But Lisitsky was not only the propaganda painter. Actually, he had left in the 20th Soviet Union. He went to the Germany, and one of the reasons why I'm picking him is that he had influence on a phenomenon which we will be discussing in a greater detail in what follows. And Lisitsky was also the accomplished contributor to what is called today design, and the creation and the use of the art for the advertisement in the business, we will say. This is, for example, what was called the New Man in 22, and this is the three-dimensional design for the electromechanical show Victory Over the Sun. If you compare today's advertisement of various items, then you can draw the conclusion that we rather see the decline of the art of the advertisement as compared to what Lisitsky was doing. And he was also an architect, and that is his drawing of Iron in the Clouds from 1925. And that was when he was done. That is a drawing of a architectural construction, which he had done being in Germany, particularly in a little school of architects in Germany, which at that time had a slightly different name, which among, I even don't mention that name, but the part of that name was called the Bauhaus, building homes. And that part of this name of that school, Bauhaus, had in the 20s and 30s becomes a word which completely revolutionized that human activity, which is called the architecture. And Lisitsky had a considerable influence on the understanding of a beauty of architectural construction as by the members of the Bauhaus, and we will be seeing that in the further course of the lecture. Lisitsky was also earlier a friend of Larionov. Larionov, I mentioned Larionov at the beginning of the lectures, talking about the fact that in the 80s, there was an attempt to forge a considerable number of drawings and small paintings by Larionov in Soviet Union. Larionov was, in some sense, the early father of the modern art in Russia, but he left Russia before the war. He went to France, and as I told you, he left basically the conventional, so to say, painting field, and he became a creator of a stage sets for many theaters in France, particularly in the Russian ballet in France. So Lisitsky was also one of his students of Larionov at the beginning. And that, remember this picture, for we will see in a moment how that influence, that in some sense, the follow-up of that picture is with us until today. But the one of the artists who made the Vitebsk school world famous was an individual who, in a kind of positioning of the artist on the scale, is comparable to Chagall, was a painter with the name Kazimierz Malevich. He was of a Polish origin, and he likes to sign his name using the Polish transcription of it. Malevich, this is his auto-portrait, was the creator, was also the teaching and working in the Vitebsk school. In particular, he was a master of Władysław Strzemiński, but Malevich had completely broken with the a figurative kind of art. And what you see on the left is one of the most famous paintings of the Malevich. It's one of those treasuries of the, oh, I'm sorry, I have not translated this correctly, in one of those world greatest museums of art, Tretiakowska Gallery in Moscow. And that particular painting of the Malevich is called the Black Square. And if you have ever seen the paintings of a modern masters like Rothko and others, you will see that how much they deserve to this break with a certain tradition and rules which have been initiated by Kazimierz Malevich. Malevich was also in France at the just before the First War, and he also was very much influenced by the Cubists. This is one of his Cubist-like paintings called The Knife Grinder, and from 1912, and there are a few other paintings. This is, I'm sorry, oh my goodness, I haven't correct the Polish well, anyway, it's a white square, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum. I mean, you have to look very carefully on that picture in order to see that there are white squares imposed over the white squares and so forth. And on the right, it's one of the masterpieces of this trend of non-figurative paintings, which have been initiated by Malevich, which is called the suprematism. Suprematism of the shape over a content. And this particular painting is in a private possession. In 1980, it was purchased by a private individual. The, so to speak, does not disclose the names of the individuals who purchased the pieces of art from them. And the price for that painting was 60 million of US dollars in 1980. It was a few years later sold on auction to another private owner already for 89 million of dollars. So that gives you the feeling how valuable is the Malevich art today. Malevich was not so much fortunate like other teachers or students of the Vitebsk School of Art. Lisitsky had returned to the Soviet Union, and he became the he survived the Stalin purges, and during the Second War, he was author of the propaganda paintings. I have not included it here, but there is a famous painting of Ellisitski, which was, well, it wasn't the advertisement, but the call to produce more tanks for the Red Army. But Malevich was, the school in Vitebsk was eventually closed by the communist government. They considered that, and I will use this word, which was later used by the Minister of Culture for the Hitler government in Germany, Mr. Ziegler, who called that part of art, we are now looking at degenerate art. And there was even an exhibition of a degenerate art. And so Malevich was considered to be the representative of the degenerate art in the Soviet Union. He had not been allowed to paint, at least officially, the paintings of that sort, and surely enough was not able to show them to the public. So he ended up his life in a kind of a desperation. And fortunately, most of his pieces of art have survived, partly those which were in the West during his life. One of the problems of Malevich was that he, in the late 20s in 27, if I recall correctly, he had been invited to Poland, to Warsaw, and he had the successful exhibition of his paintings in Warsaw. And this visit to Warsaw was used to accuse him for being a Polish spy in the Soviet Union. And that was one of the reasons of his problems. Okay, another student of the Vitebsk school who will be important for us further is another giant of the contemporary painting, Vasily Kandinsky. And this is a painting which is called the Horse Rider. And the lower picture is called the Circus. And that's the picture of Kandinsky. Kandinsky emigrated from Russia in the 20s and ended up in Germany and later in the United States. And this is one of his most famous pictures, paintings, Circus in Circles, which is on exhibits in Philadelphia. Kandinsky, similarly as the other, as Ellisitski, end up in Germany in the 20s in that little architectural school with the name Bauhaus, which I already have mentioned. I would like also to show a picture of someone who has not been in Vitebsk as a Swiss painter, Paul Klee, because he had also been associated with this architectural school in Germany. And personally, and I like this Paul Klee pictures very much. This is called the Polyphonia picture, and that is the seacoast of Provence. And if you look at this, you quickly see this that these triangles are basically the boats, sails boats on the open sea. There has been a book by a Russian writer, I forgot the name now, which was called A Lone White Sail. And that book was the obligatory reading in the high schools in the 50s when I was in the school in Warsaw. And it appears originally in the, I mean, at that time, the books were printed on a very bad quality paper, and the cover were also papers only slightly thicker than the paper on which the text was printed. And so often the books were wrapped up in another cover, which was made of a thick paper. And usually on the thick paper, there was some kind of a picture, and of course, a title of a book and so forth. And on that paper cover of the book, The Lone White Eagle, there was a painting which was somehow influenced by the Klee. It was like this particular painting, but without anything on the beach. And there was only a bluish sea, and there was a white triangle in the middle of that sea, which was that lone angle. That I have that book, and I even searched my library to find it, and I found it. But unfortunately, on this paper cover is gone. I only have the very poorly printed the real book, but the cover is, I cannot show it to you. All right, but that was, I pick up those names in order to show how they were influenced for our further discussion. But I have to tell you that this was not the only direction of art. Cubist were dominating an art of the beginning of the 20th century and basically through better part of the 20th century. But there were other giants of the art who were at the same time painting and influencing. And one of them is one of those directions in art is associated with the name of Oskar Kokoschka, who was an Austrian painter. He had been influenced not so much by the Cubist ideas, but because he was a teacher also of the art in the schools originally. He was influenced by the philosopher of one of the Bohemians, philosopher Kandinsky, who was a creator of a very important part of the contemporary thinking about education. And Kokoschka was there were lots of painters and artists who had been influenced by the Kokoschka thinking about an art. This is a picture of the Kokoschka called Lovers with the Cat. And the interesting the reason for this, I have picked up particularly that painting, is that the insider knowledge about that picture is that the lady on that picture is a very famous Viennese lady, Alma Mahler. Gustav Mahler was one of the most important music composer of those time, the author of the Das Lied from der Erde. And I apologize at the beginning of our lecture that we will be not talking about the music because of I'm not educated in music, and I am essentially music deaf, so I cannot tell anything interesting about music. But Gustav Mahler is a very famous musician, and Alma was his wife. She was also a lover of kokoschka. So the story is that this is a picture of them. And Mrs. Mahler divorced Gustav Mahler, and she married another important person of our lecture, Walter Gropius. And you will see why the Walter Gropius was important. Okay, so we had looked up on the stage of the art at the beginning of the 20th century and how it has come about. And we will now take a short, we will go backwards in time. And we will spend a part of this talk under the title, The Era of New Materials. The title of this period from the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th century until today as an era of new materials comes from the famous book on the history of art by Mary Hollingsworth. And it has somewhat started with the individual with the name Abraham Darby. He lived at the end of the 17th century, and he was essentially illiterate. And he was a person who was making metals. And what you see on here is a Darby blast furnace in the town of Coalbrookdale in Welsh. And the reason we start with the Darby is that we live nowadays in the era where we are surrounded with everything which we use, which is made out of thousands of different materials. We have a tremendous amount of different materials out of which we can build things like this. For example, if you look at each of you have this smartphone in the pocket, and at least display of that smartphone is covered with a particular glass, which is called Gorilla Glass. And the Gorilla Glass is a material which has been developed fairly recently, but it was discovered in the 30s. And all this variety of materials we are using today are very new. Until 1903, for example, we knew only those metals which were known in ancient Rome. It is incredible that we didn't have any new metal until that time, except of the fact that the revolution in manufacturing, producing these metals, have improved. And the improvement of production of metals started with the Abraham Darby, who found out how to replace the charcoal, which was essential ingredients of producing iron from the ore, by replacing a charcoal with the coke. And that make a production of an iron much cheaper and faster than originally. This, what is inside that shack, is the original blast furnace of Mr. Darby. And the fact that the Darby was able to produce a cast iron very cheaply, because the original production of a cast irons, which was known since the essentially prehistoric time, was enormously energy consuming, and therefore the cast iron was extremely expensive. But the Darby discovery, and it was the discovery that he can use a coke in making this iron, had made the cast iron cheap. And what you see here is one of the first bridges which was made from the iron. And this is 1781. And you can read on this that this bridge was cast in Colebrook Dale, and this is the year of it. This is a still existing bridge over River Velms, and it was renovated slightly, but the construction is as it was. So we are looking at the first real bridge. It is remarkable than all the history of making a metal bridges on which we drive and or walk every day is so short in the history of mankind. Cheap production of cast iron after the discovery of Darby. Darby's was a full family of these experts on iron production. There was a whole family of Darbys, and I make a short detour from a grandiose art to tell you about the short history of a food production, because the discovery of a Darby had a tremendous consequence on the health of humans. And the fact that we have stopped dying at a very early age, and that the life of our has started to increase, was partly due to the fact that all over the sudden the production of a cast iron made it possible to make kitchen utensils out of the cast irons. So this is a Greek casserole from 6th or 4th century before Christ. The kitchen utensils were made out of the clay and then properly hardened by fire, and they were very easy to break, and in particularly they were extremely difficult of keeping clean. They making it very without any grooves and breaks inside, where the used food can be left over and be a source of the growth of all sorts of bacteria, was very difficult. So for a long time, all the food was prepared in that kind of utensils, and they were slowly being replaced by the metal one, but they were extremely expensive. And this is, for example, a picture of what is called the Viking pot that was hung over the fireplace, and it was also very difficult to keep it clean, and therefore all those kind of utensils used to prepare the food was source of diseases. And that is the first modern so-called Coke pot made by the Darby already right after he mastered a production of a cast iron. That was very easy to polish. It was essentially unbreakable, and it was much easier to keep it clean. This is a particular pot, as you see, because it has these little legs. Because the ovens, kitchen ovens, the way we are having in our homes, maybe today powered by gas or electricity, are the essentially end of the 19th century invention. The pot was, with whatever was inside, could be put on those little legs directly into the fireplace. So that is a short history of a food preparation, and the jump from the old way to this iron-make coke pots. Coke comes from making the steel by in a furnace with the coke, not the charcoal. That was a tremendous jump forward in the cleanliness and therefore in the improvement of our health. That has been developed further. This is a picture from one of these French castles converted into a hotel, where you see the saucepans made out of the copper. These were very expensive and very difficult to use because they were too soft. Saucepans made out of the copper, but there was already another step forward in cleanness and making a food very safe. And the last element of that was the end of the was in the mid of 19th century, when the British engineer Bessemer had invented the blast furnace with an open end. This is the furnace of the Bessemer, and that is the cut through it and show how it was working. The trick was that there was a stream of oxygen coming with the common air through this oven, and therefore it could work at much higher temperature and much faster. Once the temperature in the oven increases, that was possible to make a step forward from cast iron to a steel. And the steel, and that was a revolution. The price of steel, which previously had been manufactured in an extremely slow way and was very expensive, that at the end of the 19th century, when the Bessemer ovens furnaces become common use, the price of a steel changed from the 40 British pounds there, to the 7 British pounds of that similar price. And that was a revolution which makes the steel cheap. And the pots and pans were now made out of steel. And steel is extremely easy to keep clean. And if you watch your kitchen nowadays, you find out that most of the pots you use are essentially made out of this steel. There were then the development, there was the stainless steel and so forth and so forth and so forth. But these discoveries, scientific discoveries of making a cheap metallurgy, progress in metallurgy, had revolutionized the health, the improvement of our health. And but still, we didn't know until 1903 any other metals than those known in the ancient Rome. And the revolution happened accidentally in that year 1903 due to the work of a certain gentleman on that picture, German metallurgist Alfred Wilm. Alfred Wilm was employed by a small metal company in the town of Düren. It is a district town in this kind of a golden triangle, which is nowadays between the Holland, Belgium, and Germany on north. And Wilm was a metallurgist working for that company. And all over the sudden, between 1903 and 1909, he found out that he can manufacture a new kind of metal, unknown before, which was an alloy of aluminum, copper, and manganese. That was very light, very hard, and ductile. So, and it was new. Initially, when Wilm made it, there was not clear way for what that metal can be used. Fortunately, the legend says that not very far from the Dürener metalworker in Düren, there was a company, Chagall, which was, among other things, making cigars. And cigars are good kind, quality cigars are pretty expensive nowadays, even nowadays. So the cigars were sold by pieces, and they were packed, one cigar, in usually a wooden, handmade kind of tubes in which the single quality Cuban cigars were sold. And someone had figured out that this metal invented by Alfred Wilm, which he called duralumin, and the word dur comes from Düren. In many textbooks, it is wrongly written that it comes from the Greek durus, a heart. No, the name comes from the town of Düren. And the Chagall started to make these tubes for expensive cigars of the aluminum. But very, very soon, the war has started, and the first airplanes were built out of wood and plywood and canvases. And very quickly, engineers find that they can also use the aluminum, duralumin, for making the fuselage of the planes. And duralumin revolutionized a contemporary metallurgy. As you see, Mr. Wilm had, after that discovery, he earns considerable amount of money, and you see him here sitting in a shirt, and if you look very carefully, you see that there is some embroidering on this shirt. And Wilm has left Düren and went up south at that time of Germany to lived in a little village close to the town, which was called, which is now in Poland, it's called Jelenia Góra. And he, with his brother, had invented the folk art. They invented the kind of shirts with the kind of embroidering on it, and many other pieces of art which were unknown before, but they managed to convince people that this is a local art, and they make a fortune on it. But no new metal was discovered after Mr. Wilm. And the metallurgists were mixing everything with everything, and they discovered lots of materials which were of no use whatsoever. And the whole thing stopped in 1920, when the bunch of metallurgists working in the United States for National Bureau of Standards had said themselves that this is sort of completely silly to do a lot of experiments without knowing whether they will lead to anything. And they recall that at the turn of a century, at the end of the 19th century, there was an individual, Joshua Williard Gibbs. This is this gentleman on this picture, who was a professor of mathematics at Yale University in the United States. He was actually a first professor of theoretical physics in the United States. He was hired by the Yale University and he was unpaid. So that is more or less what is a tradition in many countries, that professors are not or are badly paid. But Joshua Williard Gibbs had been a person who essentially single-handed had changed a science about the heat and thermodynamics into what we now have. He is also an individual who invented the vector notation. So if you are now learning or using a vector calculus, that is basically what Mr. Gibbs had invented. He got his PhD for purely applied research. He invented automatic brakes for the railroad, and those brakes had not made any success, was because at the same time Westinghouse had invented the train brakes, automatic train brakes, which are used until today. But each time you are sitting in a car and you are fastening your seat belts, this little brake, which is inside of the seat belt, is actually basic. The idea of this little ball, which moves in within when the car decelerated, the ball would move forward and brake and blocks the belt. That is the idea from the train brakes of Joshua Williard Gibbs. Anyway, the Joshua Williard Gibbs had formulated the theory of mixtures. And that was, when he wrote it, it was considered to be abstract theory, which is completely useless. But those metallurgists at the Bureau of Standards, they used the theory of Gibbs, and hell broke loose. Hundreds of new materials were discovered, metals and materials were discovered in a question of a few months. And now we have this enormous variety of different kind of metals and materials. So what happens to Velms? That is, he moved, as I said, he moved to the Jelenia Góra, next to Jelenia Góra, to the town which is now called Karpacz. The German name of it was Krumhübel, and he bought himself a house there. This is the picture of that house as it is now, and this is his home. It was called the Berghof. It's now agro-touristic place. It's a kind of a hotel, so you can go to that place in Zahomie. This is basically today it's a part of Karpacz, and you can stay in that home. Some years ago, when things were slightly different, this house was existing, but the owners of it, they had no foggiest idea of that this was a house of the discoverer of the duralumin. How it is nowadays, I don't know. I wasn't in Karpacz a long time. The Karpacz was a place where in the 60s and 70s, winter schools of theoretical physics were held. It was a fashionable place to go during the winter for a very important in the history of Polish physics schools. Okay, so that's about the Mr. Wilm. But the history of new materials does not stop on metals. We have, if we look around, we have many new materials. And one of the most important materials out of which everything around us is made is glass. And particularly, we were already talking about the glass, discussing the baccarats and the Gallet glass and so forth. But the glass which is important for the architecture is a plate glass. And the plate glass was invented in the 17th century in France. And here I have shown you a title of an article published in September 25, 1869, in already existing journal Scientific American, which exists until today. And the title of it is The Manufacture of a Plate Glass in England and the United States. The making a flat glass was much more difficult than making a blown by these pipes glass and making the cups and so forth, but it was slowly mastered. And I'm sorry. And this is a short history of the plate glass, which is of importance for us. In 1905, an American company, Libbey Owen Glass, invented a procedure of continuously drawing a glass from a reservoir of a molten glass. This continuous drawing allowed it to spread it thin and produce, therefore, a considerable size of a plate glass. Before that, the plate glass was produced, but it was a small chunks. It was not of the size of the contemporary shop window or something like this. In 1918, a British company, Beechrocks, invented the Beechrocks processes, and this continuously drawing molten glass was spread over driven rolls, and therefore it was continuously taken over from the oven and shipped forward into the factory, which allowed the further processing of that glass. In 1935, a company which I already mentioned, a Corning Glass, had invented a hollow glass blocks. You may occasionally see them by the architects, by making the walls, which looks like the glassy walls, but they are very sturdy. They are like the construction bricks. The technology of making a glass, this industrial glass, was expanding. In the 50s, the tinted glass was invented, and that was an important step because at that time the air conditioning has become popular again. Air conditioning was invented in the 30s of the last century, but it was expensive. You might see how the history of the air conditioning develops by watching the movies from the 30s, because in the movies which have been produced at the end of the 30s, you already see that the cinema halls are in the big cities are being air conditioned. In the 50s, the air conditioning becomes cheaper by a technological invention, and the tinted glass allowed to air condition much bigger areas than before. And almost a final step in what is important for my lecture in the production of a glass was done in the 1952 by the British company Pilkington brothers, which invented a so-called the floating glass. That is extremely ingenious method of producing a huge pieces of a incredible flat and free of any distortion inside of the plate of the glass pieces of glass plates. Of the standard industrial standard is 3 by 4 meters of the plate, which is generated by the technique. And then many other things have been developed. The reflecting glass, because once this process of floating glasses has been mastered, then it was possible to cover the very thin layer of a glass with the thin layer of a reflecting material. And the other, if you will ever be in Toronto, for example, in the town of Toronto, which has a rule concerning the skyscrapers, they are not permitted there. The banks have to compete with each other, not with the height of the skyscraper, by the engineering construction. And there's close to the lake building built originally by the Royal Canadian Bank, which nowadays has a different name, as far as I believe. It's called the Royal Canadian Bank of Hong Kong. Maybe it has changed already the name again, but this is a block built out with the glass walls, and the glass walls have a reflecting layer of a micron layer of a gold net in between the plates of glass out of which walls are built. So when the sun is shining on that building, it looks like a solid piece of gold standing in the middle of the Toronto. There are heat mirror glasses and various other things. This is the machine which produces the glass, and I show you a movie on that.
170 around the world. Together, they produce more than 1 million tons of float glass worldwide every year. Invented by Pilkington, the float glass process quickly became the universal method for producing high-quality flat glass for the building and automotive industries. Today, it also makes glass that insulates, glass that reflects, glass for use in electronics, in defense, even glass that produces electricity. And each line can produce 700 tons of glass a day, every day, for up to 10 years. Glassmaking uses some of the Earth's most abundant raw materials. The main constituent is sand, accounting for 60% of what is called the batch. Lime and dolomite are added to assist the weathering properties of the finished glass, while soda and sulfate lower the temperature at which sand will melt. But glass itself is also an important ingredient. Broken glass, called cullet, is recovered from the manufacturing process and then crushed before being added to the batch. This further accelerates the melting process and reduces the amount of energy required for melting by up to a fifth. All raw materials are rigorously checked to ensure the purity of the batch. It's then fed automatically into the filling end of a furnace with a capacity of 1,800 tons. Natural gas, burned in preheated combustion air, then heats the batch up to a temperature that reaches 1,600 degrees centigrade. New technology invented by Pilkington ensures that the majority of emissions from the process, including those that might cause acid rain, are either trapped or converted to harmless nitrogen. Processes within the furnaces are managed from the control room to ensure that the glass is homogeneous and free of bubbles. Inside the furnace, heat is applied from alternate sides in 20-minute cycles. This assists fuel efficiency by ensuring that combustion takes place in the presence of preheated air. The glass leaves the conditioning end of the melting zone at a temperature of 1,100 degrees centigrade through a narrow canal, from where it passes to the heart of the process, a bath of molten tin. Here, the glass spreads out, following the perfect flatness of the tin, so that the upper and lower surfaces of the glass remain absolutely flat and parallel. The glass is made thicker by confining its initial outward spread over the tin. To make thinner glass, the top rollers controlling the width of the glass are speeded up to produce a gentle stretching action. A controlled atmosphere of hydrogen and nitrogen within the bath prevents the tin from oxidizing. When it emerges from the tin bath, the glass is sufficiently hard not to be marked by the conveyor rollers. Special properties, including the ability to reflect heat, can be imparted by applying an extremely thin metallic layer to the glass while it's still hot. Pilkington K glass produced in this way increases the efficiency of double glazing by as much as 50%. The glass now enters the annealing layer, where any stresses are removed by a controlled cooling process. In a length of 250 meters, the glass is taken from 600 degrees centigrade down to room temperature. At this stage, the glass is perfect. Only the indentations left by the top rollers remain to be scored, ready for removal. This takes place after the glass has been cut and snapped to a predetermined size. Glass removed in this way is carried away on conveyors to be reintroduced at the beginning of the melting process. After passing through the automatic handling stages, customers' orders, which might involve a range of thicknesses and sizes, as well as special coatings, are held in the warehouse. Before being transferred to float liners for safe delivery to customers. Today, float glass is used wherever the demand is for clarity and precision, adding beauty, comfort, and security to the world's buildings, with ever higher standards of energy conservation. Glass systems bring safety and styling to cars, with increasing sophistication and new systems built into the glass. Float glass is also extending its usefulness to new and emerging technologies in electronics and solar power. We are just beginning to exploit its versatility.
All right, so we have been exposed to the art of Pilkington, but truly at the end you already have seen that the glass is omnipresent in the contemporary architecture. I mean, if you walk on the Jana Pawła II in Warsaw, you see the Warsaw Spire, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in Warsaw. It is just one giant piece of glass hanging over the street. The other new material, which appears at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, was reinforced concrete. Concrete is actually cement, and it has been known already in ancient Rome and was used, but it was very expensive and it wasn't perfectly usable for buildings, but it was known. And its useful has been changed in the mid of the 19th century when Francois Coynet, a French engineer, had built a house on Rue Saint-Michel in Paris, which was built, the first building built from the so-called reinforced concrete. And that is how the reinforced concrete is being made. We have a steel mesh net or lattice, which is being filled with the concrete that is done. And that is enormously sturdy building material, which is of course also much lighter than the bricks and things like this being made. And that is a show of the how the building is being erected. These are walls, and that is a kind of a shaft and so forth. And slowly, when at the same time, the Bessemer furnace was invented, and the production of steel becomes cheap. So there is a synergy in the event.
Yeah, I'm taking it somehow. Can you take one? Okay. Okay, like, yeah. Okay. Cześć, dziękuję bardzo. Like, yeah. The friends. I'm taking one friends. Is that tax?
Hello, I'm sorry. There was a lost connection. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, there was a break in the internet connection. I'm terribly sorry. I have to find out how I can reconnect my let me see whether I can.
Test. Test.
Yes, I'm trying to initiate the share screening. Can you see this now? So we had been through the discussion. Hello? Let me come back to the.
This is like mushroom, so I don't know.
There's someone speaking, and we will be all speaking. That's impossible.
But I like mushroom. Yeah. Like,
I suggest that someone stop talking. Hello?
also, I have very good mushroom, so like next time I take it because they like with this kind of mushroom which are like yellowish, and I'm not sure what
I suggest that.
Yeah.
Mrs. Gomułka, are you talking? I suggest we stop talking simultaneously. for there will be no progress. All right, let me then share the screen again. We had been talking about the concrete. Come on, stop talking.
Professor, she doesn't know her
I suggest you stop talking. For, I mean, that will be, are you hearing me?
I think she doesn't know.
Are you hearing me?
I think it's Isabella Havro who is talking. So
yeah, well, somebody has to stop talking. Otherwise, we will be in trouble. Can you hear me? Can someone answer whether you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but
okay, then we can continue, but otherwise we will be having a difficult.
I think that the person who is talking cannot hear you.
Well, but I cannot see who is also talking. But we have to go back. Let's kindly keep. All right, we have been talking about the making the iron, glass, and concrete. But what had happened on the turn of the 1920s? Come on. Well, perhaps we will disconnect that. Perhaps we will disconnect that at the lecture, and we will start with the plastic next time. But I will send you a mail with request that we are not talking on the open line when we are in the lecture, because that makes the progress impossible. I cannot continue with this situation. So thanks for being with me, and see each other next week.
okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.